Hey, everybody, this is Dr. Bill Janeshak on the Conquering Stress podcast, and I am totally excited about coming back here. And I shouldn't be, because we're going to be talking about mental health, and I guess I should be more solemn than I am, but I'm actually really excited. Today, we got a great colleague, a good friend of mine, my mentor, my buddy, the guy that I want to be when I grow up. We got Dr. Michael Pierce is on the podcast, and this is about mental health, like I said. And he said, well, mental health, let's talk about, our bones and our muscles and things like that. This is very important. I want you to take a real detailed listen, maybe do this a couple times, and definitely share this with anybody that you know that might be having some mental health issues, because Dr. Pierce is a chiropractor. He is a researcher, a teacher, a consultant. He has a diplomat in functional neurology. He has a diplomat in QEEG, which is measuring the brain waves and how the brain actually works. And and he's a certified chef as well. He has a chef certificate. But the focus is on mental health. And we're going to get into that exactly. But you can find him on YouTube, a very popular podcast style on YouTube, which is The Human Condition. And if you want to, and you should go over and check him out and do a consultation if you have any deeper questions personally. He covers a lot of stuff on the podcast in each of his episodes, but if you have specific stuff, you can go and book a telehealth conference with him on Human Condition Lab. And we've known lots of people, and I've referred a lot of people over there because it's information that you are not going to get with your 3-minute Kaiser visit. Oh, did I say Kaiser online in public? Oh, shit. Okay. Anyways, I'll refer you to my attorneys later. But I'm just talking about, in general, some of the things. It's the way doctoring should be. And like I said, the reason that my hero, my mentor, and my confidant is because I believe this is the way that healthcare should be taken. So with that being said, Doc, how are you doing?
Thank you.
I have a question for you.
Good to see you.
Yeah, well, it's always great to see you. Well, you're a chiropractor. And I'm going to ask the question everybody is asking right now. What does cracking backs have to do with mental health? I mean, are you one of those weird quacks that thinks that back cracking is going to cure everything?
Well, the short answer is yes, but no. I mean, the lesson is really a nonlinear lesson that comes from history. Over 100 years ago, the first chiropractor looked at, Harvey Lillard, the guy who was a janitor at a building, and he was deaf. And Dr. Palmer asked him in 1895. He said, how did you get deaf? And he said, well, I was bent over in a place lifting on a heavy toolbox, and I felt a crack in my back or neck or something, and I couldn't hear after that. So Palmer had him lay down on a bench, and he examined him, and he said, well, this spot over here is out of alignment in your upper back or neck. We're not sure historically exactly where it was, but it was somewhere in the upper spine. And he said, well, could I rack this back into position for you? Could I press on it and put it back into position for you? And so he had this theory in his mind that there was some kind of interference coming from the spine up to the brain and the brain out to the ears, and that was leading to a problem. And his knowledge of anatomy was pretty good back then. He had some concept that there was this autonomic nervous system, that the nerves supplied the blood control that controlled how much blood flow went to the ears, and that might be a possible mechanism for his deafness. So it was kind of an advanced theory for the time. So he cracks the guy's back on a bench, and he could hear. And so that was the story of Harvey Lillard, the janitor in Palmer's office. And so that was how this magnetic healer and fish salesman became the first chiropractor, because people had been realigning bones in Egypt and in Asia and all over the world and in Russia for centuries. Probably for thousands of years, since we first drilled holes in the head when people would get a concussion and have a water on the brain, and they would drain the head with a trephination. They would put a drill in, and that was prehistoric. So The idea that people would correct the brain and correct the spine is old, but the new idea was a short lever of using the short lever of the spinal bones to correct the bones instead of these long lever manipulations, which had been done in Asia and Russia and Germany and just all over the world. So the idea that you could use the spine to fix the brain to fix hearing also was not long after Harvey Lillard's case. There was people that had mental illness, and so they got adjustments, and they started coming to chiropractors for everything. And there wasn't a disease that chiropractic didn't help sometimes. Now, that doesn't mean that the subluxation was the cause of every disease. It simply means that once in a while, subluxation was the cause of their problem, whether it be psoriasis or eczema, sinusitis, blindness, deafness, schizophrenia, violent behavior, erectile dysfunction, any number of things, autoimmune disease, diabetes.
You're using weird words. What's a subluxation?
So this misalignment that Palmer found in the spine of this guy, Harvey Lillard, was correlated with some illness. And so he said, maybe sometimes this is the cause of disease, not always, but sometimes. And maybe sometimes it contributes to the disease. So maybe it's not the cause, but it makes it worse. And so sometimes adjusting the spine makes the disease somewhat more tolerable and gets it less severe. And other times it clears it up completely. In fact, back then, they were treating an autoimmune disease called ankylosing spondylitis using atlas adjustments of the top bone of the vertebra, and they were adjusting the sacrum, which is that triangle bone at the bottom in your pelvis below your belt, in the back, right in the middle of your butt. And they were adjusting the sacrum bone, and they were correcting ankylosing spondylitis, which was an ossifying of the spine. It was fusing together, and they would unfuse the spine from chiropractic adjustments. And it wasn't the mechanical beating of the spine to break up as if it was some kind of rusty door, rusty hinge. It was actually changing the neurological phenomena and changing the immune system. And today, we know that there are actually nerves that go to the brain that help the brain understand and control blood flow. We also know that there are nerves that detect the immune system and control the immune system. And we know that if we correct the information flowing from the body up to the brain, that we can then normalize the brain's control down to the immune system and the endocrine system and control things like hormones and control things like the immune system. And so it contributes. It doesn't always cure, but it contributes. So our aim is to reverse disease and to try to figure out if we can get people just radically well.
Yeah, and so that's the old school, the way we started out, the safety pin cycle, which is for those that aren't watching, the safety pin goes up and comes back down, and you can open a safety pin and it breaks that cycle of communication. And the basic theory that we have is that if the brain and the body are not communicating, it can't heal, because we have an innate ability to heal. We're born with that healing capacity. So the interesting thing is the topic of the day. You sound just like all the other crazy chiropractors up until now, and then you get deeper into it because you got more degrees than a thermometer, and you're going back off over there. So how does specifically you work in mental health? What are mental health issues? If we hear this thing, it's like saying, what is health? Okay, well, how are we defining that? How do we define mental health issues?
Well, gosh, they could be a couple of kinds. Mental health could be how you process emotions and thinking and how you mature as you go through the phases of maturation. Are you appropriately going from a child to an adolescent to an adult? Do you have all your faculties? Can you think and feel and emote and express fully? And some of the conditions are pathologies, like diseases, where we have names for them and we understand the causes of them very well. And others of them are a little bit more nebulous. Some of them can come from, nature versus nurture. Some of them you're born with. They're very, very genetic and not much environmental. And others are much more environmental and not very genetic. And others are a real combination of both. And so some of them can be diseases, and some of them can also be malfunctions or dysfunctions or functional lesions where there's no actual pathology. There's no brain damage. There's just a misfiring of some electrical system. It's very subtle. And those things don't rise to the level of diagnosis. They don't qualify for diagnosis within the insurance industry or in the psychiatric industry, and they don't rise to the level of deserving treatment. And yet the patient is suffering.
So those are called functional lesions. a chronic worrier, the people that that their brains can't turn off, or the anxiety issues, or what they're calling anxiety issues now, those type of stuff where they're just saying, oh yeah, or somebody that's always stressed out. Is it those kind of things?
Yeah. So anytime a person has a set of symptoms and they don't meet the diagnostic list, because you understand the way we diagnose mental illness is a book. It's called the DSM. And the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is the Bible of how to diagnose. And it's decided by about 8 people in psychiatry, and maybe 16 people. And these committees come together and they decide a list of criteria. You have to have this symptom and this symptom and this symptom, or maybe 5 of 7 or 3 of 7 or 5 of 9 for 3 months, uninterrupted or maybe interrupted, with a sleep disorder or not. And each one is a different criteria. And if you meet the criteria and you tick enough boxes, you qualify for that diagnosis of ADHD or autism spectrum disorder or schizophrenia or major depression or minor depression or anxiety or bipolar. And if you don't meet those criteria, if you don't rise to that threshold, you're not sick enough. Go away, come back when you're sick enough.
So you're technically well at that point, or you're not sick enough to do anything. So, it's kind of like the operation was a success, but the patient died. So you're still walking around kind of messed up. Okay, so we've had people for a long time, and we've had families and politicians and financial strife and everything since there have been people. Why is there such an influx of mental health issues right now?
Well, I think we've probably always had some genetic errors of reproduction that produce the odd person that has things. And I don't want to blame anybody for having mental illness. But I'd like to explain that the rising level of mental illness may not be necessary, and that in history we might not have had as much. For example, we really didn't have a lot of heart disease. Heart disease in the history of medicine wasn't a big thing. And mental illness was a thing, but it wasn't that common. And so the fact that it's becoming much more common to have autism, much more common to have depression, much more common to have personality disorders, these things are becoming much more prevalent, and it may have to do with our diet and our toxic exposures, our deficiencies, some of the things that happen in our environment. There really wasn't a cardiology profession until Eisenhower had a heart attack. We didn't really have heart conditions, and we didn't have cardiologists, much like, we didn't really have to worry too much about neurological disease. Parkinsonism with James Parkinson was first discovered, just a few hundred years ago, just a couple hundred years ago. And it was a product of the toxins of London. And so we never really had anybody write about Parkinson's in history, because our history of medicine goes back about 5,000 years. Back to Imhotep in Egypt, and back to Aesculapius and in Greece, and Hippocrates in Greece, and other healers. The Book of the Yellow Emperor in China. These are books of acupuncture and stories of what illnesses people had, and they were written about a long time ago, thousands of years ago, and they described a bunch of stuff that we've seen for a long time. But Parkinson's is relatively new. So some neurological illness has been there forever, like concussions and trephination and drilling holes in your skull to let the pressure out. And that's a pretty serious operation. But it was done by cavemen before writing. And yet today we never really saw anybody write about Parkinsonism. And so we wonder why these illnesses have happened. Autism was autism really something that was a thing in the ancient past, in the Stone Age? We don't really think so, and we don't really think that Parkinsonism exists. So we think that the compounding of society from really agriculture was the first big problem that really changed human metabolism about 15,000 years ago. That was the start of brain diseases and heart diseases, and it led to essentially fat Egyptians and the first man boobs and the first hormone dysrhythmias and the first aromatization of testosterone into estrogen, where men would become feminized from grains and eating wheat, because in Egypt was the first time that we really saw the refining of grains. In China we saw some refining of rice. So when we saw the growing and refining and the use of grains and agriculture, that was when things started to really change in metabolism, and it got worse and worse and compounded. And then industrial civilization came, and toxins and exposures and industrial pollution, heavy metal exposure, mining, the release of heavy metals into the environment. I mean, before the Industrial Revolution, the only way we'd get heavy metals would be from maybe mining, which we did. We had copper mines for, way back, and making bronze before the Bronze Age. And we had volcanoes. Volcanoes would blow up and they would blow, clouds around the earth, and they would spread mercury and lead and cadmium and all kinds of terrible stuff all around the planet for years. And so humans had a low level of heavy metals throughout our history, but it was really, really low.
Huh. So one of the things those are the things that are increasing the challenges that we have with the mental health is it that we're taking the humanity out of humans, you think? I mean, that we're not eating real foods and that we're not moving around, the basic, I guess, the criteria for life, because we're shrinking that because we're so technologically advanced that we're losing the basis of what we have. Is that what you're seeing, like, as the increase?
Yeah. I think that there's something that we call organic brain disease. And in that DSM book, they talk about something called organic brain disorders, which as a category is, if you're trying to diagnose somebody with a mental illness set of symptoms and you're trying to tick off a bunch of boxes, you want to make sure they don't have something really obvious like a bullet wound or anemia or a fever, or if you have a wild high fever, you can't diagnose somebody with, depression or anxiety because they've got the fever. If they've got a very acute thyroid, or if they've got they're having a heart attack, they've got some organic body dysfunction. And if they have an organic body dysfunction that's really physical, they might have a brain dysfunction too. And you can't diagnose them if they're anemic with some depression when they're anemic. So that category of organic brain dysfunction is what we chiropractors tend to help the psychologists and psychiatrists out with, which is to try and rule out or discover some other problem that might not just be all in your head and might not just be the emotions and problems with your mother and your childhood and your father and your trauma and your environment and your nurturing and being raised up, and also not your genetics. It might be a heavy metal poisoning or a concussion or a metabolic disorder like diabetes or thyroid, both of which are really on the rise because of our current diet. We don't really see that as much in the Stone Age.
So now that's very interesting, because what the audience is hearing you say is that the structures can be at risk, and if the brain functions and the lobes and the criterias and the thyroids and the things that they're doing, the chemical makeup over that gets off, then the brain doesn't fire right, and you can have these symptoms. Now, you'd mentioned some history before about just chiropractic in general. Can you share a little bit about the chiropractic asylums that they used to have?
Oh yeah, and from the onset of chiropractic, there have been sanatoriums and sanitariums throughout Russia and throughout Asia and throughout Europe and in the Americas from even before chiropractic. But once chiropractic was invented and really discovered, there was chiropractic sanitariums, and they were places where people sought sunlight, which is quite medicinal. There's a whole long series of lectures we could do on how important sunlight is for our metabolism and the different components of sunlight, and what it does to different parts of our cells and our brain and our eyes and our hormones, as well as what chiropractic does to the blood flow of the brain and to the lymphatic drainage of the brain and to the cerebral spinal fluid that flows around the brain. And there were these places in California, in Colorado, in several states. We had in Iowa, there were several sanatoriums like the Clearview Sanatorium, where actually when many times different people, like, for example, young men would be taken in by the police and for violent behavior or for criminal behavior, they would go before a judge in the early 1900s and late 1800s. And the judge would sometimes say, you have a choice. You can go to jail, or you can go to the military, or you can go to a sanatorium. And they would go to a sanatorium, and very often the chiropractors that led the sanatoriums and the naturopaths and the other doctors that were natural and homeopaths would heal them. And that was all before about 1911, when the Flexner report came out. Abraham Flexner was hired by the Carnegie Institute and the Rockefellers to really revolutionize medicine into a commercial venture. And they crushed homeopathy and partly chiropractic, and they crushed osteopathy, and they absorbed everything into the medical schools, and they crushed the doulas and the midwives, and they crushed the naturopaths, and they crushed the napropaths from Chicago. They crushed all the acupuncturists, and the only ones who survived that bottleneck of the investigation of education in 1911 was the chiropractors, because we had our own money. We had our own money because Palmer was a rich family. The Palmer family was rich because of radio. They had expanded radio west of the Mississippi, and because they were radio magnates, they were communication gurus, they had money galore, and they actually advertised that any doctor who graduated from Palmer that was a chiropractor that was put in jail for practicing chiropractic or medicine without a license or something or whatever, that they would pay to get them out of jail.
Wow. So that's the thing. They were taking care of the crazies before that. And, it's interesting because when we first, as chiropractors, became licensed was because of the pandemic, of the 1918 pandemic. And because our outcomes were so awesome with no drugs and no surgery, that's when they gave us a second look, and they opened up the Pandora's box for everything that we're doing, because we were the first, big one around in the United States of holistic. And it's interesting because, you and I both are always talking about, well, yeah, get adjusted and watch your diet and get some exercise, get some sunlight, start doing this. And, somebody comes in with a headache, well, get adjusted, get some sunlight. My back hurts, we'll get some, my stomach hurts, we'll get adjusted, and I almost feel crazy sometimes doing the same thing. So, well, you told me to do the same thing. Well, it's the same thing, but now we're talking about mental health. And I'll get this a lot. I said, well, you should get adjusted. Well, you're not a psychologist. You're not doing that. We've been trained to look for the specialist that, well, that's a mind thing. Well, is it a brain thing or is it a mind thing? Because those are two different aspects of it.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing that I've seen an increase is relatively typical people now, anxiety, depression, they're just off, they're triggered, they're anxious, they can't sleep, they can't do this. And again, they're not, like you said, they're not diagnosed, but they don't feel right. So when we have people like this, and usually it comes as almost like a syndrome, headache, neck pain, back pain, knots in the upper cervical area, their lower back, they get fatigued, some digestive upset, maybe some thyroid issue, a little autoimmune, definitely some adrenal stuff going on, balance issues going on. And when something is like gnarly, and we say, okay, well, we got to look into this a little deeper, and I'll send them toward your way or another professional's way and get some more insight. We'll do some different tests. What clinical signs will you see on blood work, any specialized stuff, the QEEGs that I know? And for people that aren't that are listening, what QEEGs are, and correct me if I'm wrong, or there's more embellishment on it, you're putting a little cap on with the electrodes and measures the brain waves that's coming out of the brain, so you can measure and quantify what's going on. Oh, good. We have visuals. We have visuals.
Yeah, so keep talking. This is exactly what you're talking about.
And it goes on. It's a cute hat. And it gets on there, and then all those little red things. And for people that are just listening on that, Dr. Pierce is having the 2025 version of the most beautiful cap that we have on the runway today. And it's in specific areas on the cranium, and it picks up the brain waves on both hemispheres. So what's the significance of that?
The device does not send any electricity into your brain, which could be scary. Although what it does is it picks up natural brain waves that come out of your brain. So you've got right over here. You've got this guy. This is my buddy, my assistant here. You can see his brain. If you can see around the bricks, he's got it's a skull with a brain there, and your brain emanates brainwaves. Your heart emanates heart waves, and they come out of your body and they come out of your head, and they can be picked up just like radio waves, just like any kind of wave. And they can be picked up by simple electrodes. Those happen to be silver chloride, and some are tin and some are gold, but in this case it's silver. And so they just pick up passively the brainwave. There's no power in the device. It's just a piece of metal that sits on your head with some salt water, and it receives the brainwaves that come out of your head and through your skull. And then it sends it to the computer through a wire, and then the computer maps out and draws squiggly lines that shows the brainwaves. And we can interpret those brainwaves, and we can either decide that someone has a clear disease, or we can say that they have somewhat less than a disease, which is a functional error. And that's what QEEG is. QEEG is somewhat less than pathology, whereas pathology would be something that's truly, truly damaged, like a seizure disorder or a really clear encephalopathy, or something like a fever, something terrible, something much more pathological. So you can detect not too bad stuff and much worse stuff. And it's used in medicine, it's used in hospitals, it's used in psychology offices, it's used in chiropractors' offices. In fact, we've done it in your office quite a number of times on your patients.
Yeah, because I'm a big fan, and for you guys listen, so we see post-concussion a lot of, because of my history. I'll track seizure people that'll coming in, and anxiety disorders, sleep issues, breathing issues, things like that. So we drag you down to do some of the tests for our folks, because they're suffering, and they don't qualify for you have brain tumor, you have this. They're going, oh yeah, no. And the thing that irritates me is that when you get into the traditional model that they do, if you're not dying, or they're not going to do something drastic, oh well, you're okay.
Yeah.
Let's wait and see if it gets worse, and then let's do something about it.
Yeah. I just have to say, I think it's really easy to explain this because people get really confused about it. But I think it's really important to say that, when doctors say you're sick or you're not sick, it's really a lot easy to understand it. I live in Colorado, and we have ski hills around here. We have people that run and people that bike and people that ski. And if you took an orthopedic surgeon and you had that orthopedic surgeon go watch people run and hike and ski and bicycle, they would say, yep, they're all normal. But if you had an Olympic coach watch them all, the Olympic coach would say, oh, that one's not qualified. That one is qualified to be an Olympian. And so the difference of functional is something that an orthopedic surgeon would just blow right over and say, you're fine. Or a neurologist in the case of brainwaves. The neurologist would look at the brainwaves and say, you're not sick, next. You're not sick, next. But are you healthy? You could see a lot of variations of really bad skiing down the hill, and it's not a pathology. There's nothing wrong with that person, but they suck as a skier. You see what I mean?
You know what's interesting, and it was kind of to go on top of it. I just had a friend of mine who's an avid biker. He bikes probably 100 to 150 miles a week, and has been doing it for decades. Has multiple bikes, loves biking, does everything like that. He recently went over and got refitted. He was getting a new bike, and now with technology, they put all the points on him, and they had him on a tester bike, and they went through everything millennial. It was 2 millimeters up on the seat. Does the seat go left and right? The cranks, he said, now the cranks, and the cranks for you guys listening or watching is the thing that the pedal's stuck to, how long it is. And with physics, the longer the lever arm, he says now they're going shorter because now you're taking pressure off the quad, where people have become quad dominant using, and they would get a muscle imbalance. And, it's all this rabbit hole stuff. And 3 hours of this guy that obviously is a good biker, nothing's wrong with him. And he said it's day and night. He uses a third less energy to go 20% faster, longer, harder, better, and quicker, before this. And if he just got his basket and he put Toto in it and he's ringing his bell, ring ring, he's riding the bike and he's fine. So the people that are looking for their health and just their well-being, that goes to the doctor and says, no, you're fine. You don't have a full-blown seizure disorder. Concussion, yeah, we'll take it easy, and it's rudimentary, but people still suffer.
Yo, yeah.
And so that's the stuff. So what types of things would you find on a QEEG, if someone's brain waves, when if they're coming to you with, they go, I'm anxious, I just feel depressed, and I don't, my motivations, I want more, the typical stuff. What would you find objectively?
Well, there's generally a few things that we look for. A really healthy brain has a certain way that the brain waves look. The squiggles look a certain way. And they're a little different with your eyes open versus closed. But in general, what you're going to see is some intrusion of extra slow waves that shouldn't be there, and some intrusion of extra fast waves that shouldn't be there. And sometimes there's a shift of the dominant wave, because there's a dominant wave, which is usually called the alpha wave, which is your idle speed. Your brain, most people's brains idle an adult at around 10 hertz, 10 cycles per second. So your brain is kind of humming along like at a stop sign going at 10 hertz. And so sometimes that idle frequency shifts up or down, and that can represent a change in state, or it can be different in different places, or it can be more dominant in different places. And it's supposed to be dominant in the back of your head, especially when your eyes are closed. And so those are the three things: excess slow waves, excess fast waves, and a shift in your dominant resting frequency. Those are the three big things that we look for in an EEG for function, without looking for pathology. And pathology is another story. Those are seizure disorders, and those are waves that are all more crazy. And I can explain those another day.
Yeah, but so that's the function thing. So if you see somebody that's supposed to have squigglies in the back, and then they tend to be more in the front during this time, and are we talking like, because it's is it a frontal lobe versus an occipital lobe? So that everybody listening, that the frontal lobe is like your filter. Like, yeah, so like I've been accused of not having a very good one, but so if you see that as a functional neurologist, is you come back, what do you do with that information?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of wave alterations, and there's too many to list. But if we see a wave alteration, we look at what it is and where it is, and we then tell the person, do you have symptoms like this? Because a lot of times it'll belie some symptoms that would very much fit those brain waves. And 9 times out of 10, we tell them, and they're like, oh my God, how did you know? And so it's almost like a cold read, like a psychic, because we're not psychic, we're using science, but we might not know anything about a person and do a cold read of the EEG and say, well, do you have these things? And the person and their family goes, oh my God, how did you know? And we describe the symptoms very accurately and very often, because that's their brain dysfunction is right there on the page in the ink.
Well, and your mentor and you yourself, you can look at these things and almost say, we've talked before about you can see a certain brainwave said, oh, this is going to make a good CEO, because we can see that the decision-making abilities and the strong will is going over here. Or you'll see something slower, say, well, you're almost falling asleep for these 10-second periods. Do you feel tired or that?
Spacey.
Yeah. So you actually see this, and it's almost like a cold reading or a palm reading, or you're going on. But to me, and I hope the people listening and watching this is that it's showing how important your brain is, because it will reflect on how you're doing, and why, the TikTok crack my back kind of thing has to have some knowledge or a reason behind it, or an outcome. Just like D.D. Palmer said, well, let's try to get the hearing back of Harvey Lillard and see what we can do with that. Yeah. So are there any other physical signs that somebody may have if they're depressed or they're constantly anxious, or anything that they can look at, their hands or their feet or their the any physical signs
Well,
for?
sure. I mean, from a nutrition perspective, we look at hair and nails and skin all the time, and we look at different signs of vitamin deficiencies and mineral deficiencies, and in the cuticles and in the whites of the eyes, and the quality of the hair. But probably some of the most interesting ones are the postural changes that happen in mental stress. You see the posture of Parkinson's, the posture of depression, the gait of a person who is having mania. The way that a person may move is something that you're really into, and that you've spent a lot of time working on, which is, how does a person move? What ranges of motion do they not have available to them? What ranges of motion do they live in and they stay in and they don't really muster out of? And that restriction is really important because it reflects kind of a map of their brain and their cerebellum and in their parietal lobe that shows where they're restricted and where they can't move. And you, with your chiropractic especially, you really analyze that and show people how to identify those restrictions, compare themselves to somebody who does move more fluidly, and then help them discover more freedom of movement.
Sometimes we make them.
And more freedom of thought.
Yeah. Now
Yeah.
that's awesome. I mean, that's exactly what we want to hear, because when it's interesting, because I'll see people that, like I said, have the syndrome, and they usually come in to me because I'm the chiropractic office. We have a brick and mortar, so they come chiropractor, headache, neck pain, back pain, car accident, sports injury, kind of thing. But then when we dig deeper in the history, that I've learned a lot from you on, well, let's find out why, and we'll go back down and we'll go, okay, yeah, you can't move into like that. Oh, and you're constipated, and you have spotty menstrual cycles, have painful menstrual cycles. You got tenderness in the breasts. You have insomnia. Your balance is off. You forget things. You forget names. You can't recall names where your keys are, and they usually have some sort of what they call mental trauma or something. But all those things go together, and before they start even mentioning, I'll notice how smoothly they walk, or how they're how smooth they get. They may still feel the same pain or whatever else, but I'm going, okay, this person's, their brain is coordinated, because movement is a neurological process. It's not just, we're not just levers and pulleys moving things around. It's and I want you guys that are listening or watching this, is when those levers and pulleys, and I'm talking about muscles, tendons, ligaments, bones, fascia, meniscus, and discs, and all the things that move, their job is to give feedback to the brain to make it fire. So when Mike puts that cute little bonnet on your head that's measuring these things, it's going to normalize that. If you have a left-handed arm swing that's not as optimal as it was before, that means the joint's not firing properly. So all that input, the giant computer that our brain is, doesn't have all the data to compute. So when it starts to get that data, it starts to get clearer processes out, and that's when people tend to get better. And what I found with the mental health stuff is when you start moving better, your brain starts coming back better, and those symptoms, and I just did a class. I was talking about the xiphoid nucleus, that when that's stimulated in rats, it increases bravery. And I don't know if you saw that study, but they would have they had a mouse, and then they had a shadow go over like a hawk, where usually the mouse would either freeze or run. So it's fight or flight. And when they stimulated the xiphoid nucleus, what happened was the mouse got up, and it was like that old picture of the mouse flipping off the bird, and it was the last stand of defiance or something like that. It was just like, like calling out the perceived hawk, and it was just by stimulating that portion of the brain. So it just kind of gets a little bit better. But that's my findings. So I'm going to ask you some really questions, and I know you did this on a couple good videos on your podcast. With mental health issues, how do we best manage it, control it, and I'm going to use your words, reverse it, because I can't use the word cure because that's illegal, because we're not using drugs or surgery to do that. So how can we manage, control, or reverse without medications? Because we're told that's really the only thing. Once you tick the boxes, you just have to take medication because you have a chemical imbalance.
Yeah. Well, I think we've been victims of propaganda for 100 years. And unfortunately, the sneaky way, the seductive way that they've kind of trapped us is they've said, yeah, but what about the really rare exception where somebody, does something really wild and kills themselves or kills other people or does something really, really strange or something really dangerous. And those rare situations that can happen where someone they grew up with a malformation and they die of it or something, and the doctor misses it. And they say, see, that thing should cause you fear. And that thing can be lurking anywhere and it's about to bite you in the ass. And no matter what you are or how you are, if you don't always go to the doctor, you could die of some horrible, awful illness because some random person had a rare arteriovenous malformation that's 1 in 100,000, and the doctor missed it and the person died. Now that's going to happen. There's going to be the occasional rare person that has a symptom and they don't understand it and they don't go to the doctor and they drop dead, and it's going to be extremely rare. And medicine capitalizes on that and uses the fear of that to make us think that it's common, and it's not. Most things are not that. Most things are food and detoxification and sunlight and stress and being loved and feeling loved and expressing yourself and having a fulfilling life. And most of the time, restoring those things will fix whatever ails you. Once in a while, there is going to be some really scary thing that you're born with, that not you, but somebody's born with, and it takes them out, and it's scary. And you're like, wow, that was really scary. It could have happened to me. Well, yeah, so is lightning. So is a meteorite, but they're extremely and exceedingly rare, and there's no way for us to prevent them. So why should we bother worrying about them? They're going to happen. They're going to happen. They're sudden. They're quick. They're, mercifully fast. And usually the rare cancers that affect, children and adults that really slowly kill you and are painful, most of those are chronic and they're man-made. Right. So those illnesses are not natural. That we made those. Those are our own pesticides and our own chemicals and our own fault. That's our own damn fault. But most of the weird ways that people die in scary ways, think of them as meteorites, earthquakes, volcanoes, lightning. Think of that. Nothing you can do to prevent it. I mean, actually, there are things you can do to early detect it. And some cultures have even learned how to figure out where lightning is going to be, when earthquakes are going to occur by watching animals, etc. So the point is, there are some exceedingly rare things that you shouldn't use as the rule. The general rule is, if you follow the ideas of healthy living, you can reverse most of the illnesses that we've caused ourselves as a society.
So when you said it, you had told me that, didn't they just find out that, was it schizophrenia was oxidative stress?
Well, that was bipolar disorder. That was William Walsh has published a really interesting new study and announced he's been studying 8 years. You may have heard of Linus Pauling, the guy who discovered vitamin C and had two Nobel Prizes. Well, he was followed by Carl Pfeiffer, and Carl Pfeiffer's institute was led after he died by William Walsh. And then William Walsh out of Chicago studied 30,000 people, 10,000 of them in the Chicago prison system. And he was able to show in the last 8 years that bipolar disorder and several other problems that happen to bipolar patients are related to oxidative stress, which is almost entirely a lifestyle issue. You don't get oxidative stress if you live naturally. If you're naked in the sun and eating food from around your area, you're not going to have oxidative stress. If you're a part of the modern society, oxidative stress is going to bite you.
And that just kind of gets in. And so it's always going to get back down to, and, I I used an analogy that I stole years ago about the way that we're taught, and it's like if your house is on fire and the fire department shows up and it's just going on, and they come in with hoses ablazing, and then they put that out, and they take the axes and they get holes in the ceiling and everything else like that, and you are so thankful that you're alive and you can do that. And then if they came over to you and they said, all right, well, we're going to come by once a week and we're going to douse your house with the water, and then we're going to just put new holes in the thing, you would go like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. The fire's out. I have to go and clean. No. I don't want that done. What, are you crazy? Fires are dangerous. Fire, you just saw what this fire could do. Do you want it to happen again? Then we have to keep doing this. And it's almost the
It'd be a shame if something was to happen to this nice business of yours.
Exactly. It was like, you pay me now, you pay me later. But that's what we've been talking about, and trying to lead this the thought virus that we've been held up. Because you mentioned before that we were our profession, we were arrested quite often.
My relatives were put in jail.
Well, I've seen your family, so that makes no. I'm not surprised. With for chiropractic?
Yes. Yeah, I've got chiropractors going back generations, and they were put in jail in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah, so it was for going against the narrative, and that's how they did it back in the day. And it was, the last few years where we just come up and all we're doing is question. We go, okay, well, we're doing X, you're asking us to do X, Y, and Z. I have a question about A, B, and C. And it was like, don't question us. This is a problem. And the problem is, and it would be fine that if the outcomes were beneficial, if they had data that says, yeah, well, we've been doing this for 100 years, and this is how awesome we are. This is how healthy we are now, and this is how much better off we are. And whether it's healthcare, finances, education, and everything that we're going, and we're bringing this all together, because if healthy people and healthy brains, they act better and they're not under duress, they tend to create more. And when they create more, they tend to benefit people, because that's human nature, is to be good people. And we get enough, but I think we've been under a microscope, and with, the thumb on our tails. And I think that creates a lot of stress in a lot of people, because you feel out of control.
Yes, I have to interject for a second. You've really raised something that I think is extremely important, which is the relationship between health and the structure of finance and society. You mentioned finance just a little bit, and we have this thing that we've been nudged into for a long time called the rentier economy. And the rentier economy is the idea of extracting rents from the average person. The idea that you got to pay rent for everything all the time, and you can never be free and have your own independence. There is a not so controversial idea that health of people is related to banking and money. And that many experts have talked about this. Very famous experts like Jacob Nordengard, who's written about the Rockefeller family's work and meticulously documented these things. Michael Hudson, the economist, Richard Werner, the economist. They've all written about the idea of central banks and private central banks and interest and the merging of government and corporations to control healthcare and to control finance. A sound money. All of these things are linked together, and they're related to each other. And there is a problem. And if we don't address the higher problem of politics and money and sound money and the economy and regulations and banking and finance and rentier tendencies of people like Bill Gates, we will never ever fix health fully, and we'll never have healthy families again.
Yeah, no, and that makes sense. And and I always said that health leaks, and it leaks into your personal life. And you had mentioned before, one of the basic things we need to be loved, and we have to have gratitude. We have to have this internal stuff, and it's all influenced because our finances, and they shouldn't be, but a lot of things shouldn't be and should be, but our finances are another pillar of our health, because our finances are going to be basic in the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy of that. If I don't feel safe and I don't feel secure and I don't have a roof over my head and I don't have the food the real food that I need, I'm forced to buy the McFake food that comes around that's filled with non-edible foods. And I think if you're listening to this or watching this, somewhere along the time you've seen the 20-year-old Big Mac that hasn't decayed yet, that we're calling food, or about GMO foods that they're sprayed and they're banned in half of the other countries around the world, and it all has to do with finances. Because even when we look at healthcare, and I started this podcast, and I didn't know if you were going to make me go on this whole damn rant that I'm about to go on, but you bring that out in me, you love. But the point being is, when I had mentioned a large industrial healthcare system, it's not. It has nothing to do with healthcare. It's this fantasy land where people can go over and who don't feel well, and they can pretend like they're getting health care, and the people that work there can pretend like they're giving health care, and there's a transaction between the two, which is monetary, because it's not health. They're not saying, hey, I know you're depressed and tired and you have knots in your head and your stomach and you can't sleep and like that, and here's something. It's a 3.5-minute visit where we can only talk about your right shoulder today. If you want to talk about your left hip or your belly button, those are two different.
You got to see a specialist for that.
Yes. And and there's so many specialists,
belly button specialists,
to run you through the maze where you get to continue to pretend, well, I'm going to see a specialist for my left ear problem. And it takes 6 weeks to do that. So by that time, it's either going to go away or you're going to die. And either way, we don't have to deal with it. But we took care of you. But wealthy people, they don't have that. They hire you and pay you an extraordinary amount of money to go back over to manage their health care properly, to make sure this is the test done, it's interpreted the right way. There's a question in there that we're going to have to retest on this to make sure that we have clarity, so we get enough information to go through that. One of the most fascinating things that I'm always impressed with what you do is to diagnose without the test, based on presentation, and verify with the physiological tests or the anatomical state, like MRIs and X-rays and things like that, to go, okay, we got a clear picture over here. Let's march forward this way. And rather than lying to these people that are getting true healthcare and saying, oh yeah, take this pill, you'll feel better, and take 2 of these and call me in the morning. You're going to say, okay, well, this is a 3-month process, or this is something chronic. And since our body turns over, every 120 days, new blood cells, it's going to take some time for us to do that. But in about 6 months, you're going to start doing really good, and you can go live your dreams. And people pay for that. But when you don't have the resources to, and it's like, oh, should I eat this week or do my food sensitivity test? Or these are the problems that we've come in. And I think this is about mental health. And my rant wasn't to get away, but it was to broaden the spectrum of what we're doing as part of the stress. A lot of it's financial.
Yeah.
keeping up with the Joneses. I'm in California, so oh my God, everything's so expensive. Most of the people I know are two paychecks away from, really problem, and that's a worry in the back of their mind. I think the lack of faith and people going back over and feeling safe in things that's an issue.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I wanted to ask you over here was, so we have these people, they don't get to get the label, and they don't really know what to do because they weren't awesome enough to find this podcast or your podcast and to get treated, but they're just treachering on. They pick up their cross and they're going every day, and it gets worse and worse. And Pooh, this is how it is anyways. I knew it was going to be a sucky
Thank
life.
you, ER.
Yeah. So when they get, what's the long-term health effects for with mental health issues?
Well, I think the beautiful thing about mental health is the big misunderstanding of mental health is the same as with physical health. Chiropractors know this, but the rest of the world doesn't really know this. There's a few points in American history and points outside American history where medicine turned off for a while. There were times when hospitals were shut down or groups in certain parts of the world were shut down, either states or cities or universities or different regions where medicine shut down for either political reasons where the doctors crossed their arms and said, we're not going to practice, or somebody told them they weren't going to practice, or they were shut down for earth reasons like a natural disaster. And every time health outcomes were better. And so it's interesting to think that, we're trained that if you don't have mental health access to drugs and mental health, as we practice it today, that there's going to be a terrible decay and society's just going to fall apart. And the funny thing is, if you just leave people alone, most people will do better. Now, there will always be a few very critical care people. And I want to be very careful to say that there are critical care people that must have their medication, and they must have it every day. And they could really, really go off the rails and, literally crash their car because of missing their medication for a day or two. Those are extremely rare. And even those people can be helped if we can really dig into their cases, but we can't do it immediately. So I'm not saying that we should just stop all medical care and cut it off and everybody would be fine. But if we did that, the statistics would prove the fact of what even Kennedy is looking for right now, which is trying to understand, where does autism come from? How do we treat measles? What is the effect of jabs? All these things are really important. And I think for mental health, it's the same thing. If we could really look at what is the truth and really study placebo controlled, when you don't do the medical thing, what happens? And those are the vax-unvax studies, for example. And there are other studies that have nothing to do with vaccination. They have to do with other illnesses. But when you do a true placebo control where you don't do the thing, you really start to see what the truth is. But when you muddy that, you never, ever know.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I think, there's always the conflict, but I'm excited with just let's pull back the curtain and it's first principles. Why do we believe that? Well, because we've always believed it and it's true. We never look at it. Let's go back to first principles on those things. And I always compare it to what my parents told me growing up. This is how we celebrate Christmas. This is where we store the toothpaste. Well, why do we do that? Well, because that's how we did it, because their parents did it and their parents did. So a lot of these things that we're believing today was based on a 20-year-old family member that was raising a kid who knew shit, but they just did that, and it just became tradition.
Yep.
But it was called fact when it was just ritual, and now we live in an age of Google and AI and sending celebrities into space for 10 minutes and bringing them back and calling them astronauts. And
Yeah, that just happened. Oh God.
well, but the point is, it's time for us to question, like Kennedy's doing. I mean,
Yeah.
we're hippies, and we grew up in the the chiropractic wellness kind of. So we're kind of retarded, me and you. So
Stubborn.
more than others, but the point being is that we've already had this schema and this paradigm that we know to be true to ourselves. Maybe we're wrong. We don't know. Let's question it. Let's test it. But that's all he's doing for the general population. But when we got a bunch of muggles out there that are going, no, it's always been like that. Mom did it that way. Grandma did it that way. And back then they were told X, Y, and Z. But, we look at polio and, if you look at the data, polio was on its way out before the vaccination was even
Years before. Yes.
Yeah. And yes, it was terrible with the things that it did, but well, what if we could go back there? Would we change hygiene? How was food at the time? Was there a new influx of heavy metals that were going on? We really don't know. And we're not even asking anybody to change things.
Yeah.
But let's just investigate what we're doing to make it clear.
There's a couple in New Zealand, a couple of medical doctors. They're married to each other, Sam Bailey and Mark Bailey, and they live in New Zealand, and they've got a beautiful family, and they both were practicing medical doctors. Now, she had a show on TV, and she got into some controversial things and got kicked out and said some things during COVID. And essentially, she then was invited to co-author a new version of a book that's been around for a while with new versions called Virus Mania. And she examined the history of viruses and looked at it very objectively and looked at the history of these viruses. And then her husband wrote a series of stuff about the virology and viral theory. And they were essentially questioning, what is the germ theory? Now, there's nothing wrong with questioning in science. You're supposed to question. And I'm not telling people that you can't catch something from somebody and that you can't be sick and you can't be run down and catch something from somebody. But what they called attention to very briefly, was this idea that there were a lot of studies around the turn of the century and later, all the way through mid-century, where they took people that were essentially well and they brought in sick people and they coughed in their face, they spit in their mouth, they coughed in their eyes, they sneezed in their nose, they took swabs of stuff from the sick people's nose and shoved it up the nose of the healthy people. They did STD studies where they took prostitutes and they took samples of the horrible pus that was coming out of their genitalia and they stuck it in the person who was healthy, and they could not reproduce the infection in healthy people. Now, I'm not saying that when people are run down, they can't catch something from somebody else. But if germ theory is true completely and there is no resistance and it's all based on the germ's virulence, then that shouldn't be true. And so what Sam and Mark Bailey did as medical doctors, modern medical doctors, and highly acclaimed medical doctors that worked in hospitals and worked in research, they actually gave up their practice politically in order to start this message and be able to talk about it because they were being persecuted. So they gave up their medical license to practice. And after they gave up their medical license, instead of pursuing them and saying, you can't say these things, we're going to take your medical license away, the authorities in New Zealand flipped over and said, well, now you can't say that because you're not a doctor. So it was like, you can't, there's no way they could be okay. By having a license, they were wrong. By not having a license and speaking out, there's just no way. They had to be muzzled. So this idea that I'm questioning and that you're questioning is one that, is germ therapy paramount? And is it true that people get sick no matter what? And what they're calling attention to is a lot of studies show that you can't get well people sick through infection and contagion. So what I'm calling for is a question of, what is contagion? Is contagion where sick people that are already sick have organisms that come and eat tissues on their body that are already degraded and are giving us a service, almost like those fish that go on sharks and they eat the dead skin cells off the shark, and it's a favor to the shark. Now, I'm not saying that when you have gangrene or if you have leprosy that's a favor, but in a way it is a favor because the organism is saying, well, that part of you is dead, so I'm just going to eat it away. Now, presumably, if you were able to get healthy enough and survive, you'd be okay and you'd regrow that tissue. That would be Robert Becker's idea, which is the idea that if you're truly, truly healthy, you could regrow that tissue that got eaten away.
No,
And that's called the current of injury. And that's, I'll end my story on that. But I just want to question. I want to really say, do we know what we're talking about when we talk about measles and we throttle RFK and we say, oh, you can't talk this way about autism and measles and COVID?
Well, and I think that, and that's why I wanted to do the mental health thing, is because it's had such a tick and a rise, and don't take this the wrong way, listeners, but we've created weaker people, and I mean weaker immune, physically weaker. I think the teenage males have the lowest testosterone that they've ever
and sperm
had.
counts.
Yeah, and all this is going down, but we're weak-minded as well, because back when I was a kid, we went through stuff, and the parents yelled at us and got in trouble at school, and there was financial stuff going on, I'm sure, with the family, and this and that, and blah, blah, blah. And we had measles, muscles, and chicken pox, and like that. And we called it Tuesday. And then we got up on Wednesday, and we just went on with life. And if that was the norm, it didn't bother us. But now, if I don't have, my red M&Ms, and they're short of that, I'm triggered, and I can only eat this food, and I only want this, and I'm tied to the screen, and we're just weaker people, and we are the same ones that are getting sick. So when there's a virus that goes around that we're told should infect everybody, they get sick, and we don't have the relevancy. I think expectations are lower, entitlement is higher. Well, I should have this, and I should have this, and if we grow up in a pretty good society, but now if you're 21, 22, 23, 24, you're starting out in life, and you're expected to start like we all did. Here's your starter apartment, and here's your bigger apartment, here's your first home, and here's your second home, and you move up. But we want to, as soon as we leave, emulate the lifestyle and stuff that our parents took 40 years to develop, that we grew up in. So, as practitioners, we see the end results, which are the symptoms. And like I said, I keep going back to it's a syndrome. And I think mental health was really important. And I think we should close this out, but I'd love to invite you back, because there's a lot. We always have good rabbit holes that we can crawl down in and find out. And my favorite thing about our conversations are not the answers, but the questions and the figuring out. And if anybody's been listening to this and takes away, it's about the questions. Why is there mental health over here? Do I have a chemical imbalance? Why is that? Can I unimbalance myself? And what I want to do, and take away that the body is a great self-healing, self-regulating mechanism, as long as there's no interference from the brain to the body and the body to the brain. And if we treat it with the right things, and food and eat and sleep and poo-poo and pee-pee and exercise and moving around and solid finances that you're going, you can do anything that you want.
Yeah.
So anything you'd love to close out with, Mike?
Well, it's so much fun to talk with you. And I just, everybody asks me about root causes, so I'll end on root causes. I think the root cause of the health crisis is the financial crisis. Mm-hmm. And you said it a minute ago, families used to be able to have a certain kind of family, and then they expected to be able to do the same thing. And, certainly that they should adjust their expectations and not try to get what their parents had at the end of their life, at the beginning of their life. However, However, at the beginning of their parents' life, one parent's income was enough to own a car and a house and a boat and a cabin, and income tax was different, and that all comes from inflation, which comes from central banking, which comes from private central banks, and that is the root cause of the health crisis. And so I don't want people to forget the root cause. We really have to look at the root cause, which is structural. It would be so easy to fix and finance all of the wellness and all of the healing of both the sick people and the preventing of future sick people, and wellness and flourishing and great families and great healthy children if we would address those financial problems.
All right. So what I just heard was that Dr. Michael Pierce wants to come back on this podcast and talk about the financial implications of what's going on, and we can sit down and go down that rabbit hole, because I think that's a wonderful idea. So we'll look forward to that. So everybody listening, if you're watching over on YouTube, take this and share it, and be on the lookout, because we'll have Dr. Pierce back. I know that conversation. We've had it before. It's very, very interesting for those of you that are questioners and would like some really cool perspectives on the cause of the cause, because that's what we do here. That's how we conquer stress, and that's why this podcast exists, so we can have these conversations. So this is Dr. Bill Janeshak on the Conquering Stress podcast, and I want to thank Michael Pierce for being here. Again, click subscribe and do everything else you're supposed to do on YouTube to keep these things alive. And, they always say, well, help me make more of these things we can bring out to you. But even if you don't do that, I'm still going to do them anyway. So I'm not going to tell you that. But share this, because we're about to give you some even more acute insight that's going to help you conquer stress to the best. So till next time, peace out.